Are you ready to unleash the power of podcasting to grow your audience, establish your authority, and skyrocket your revenue? If so, you are in the right place. Today, I'm super excited to be joined by Susan Diaz. She is the founder and CEO of the Toronto content marketing firm C&P Digital and the author of UNboring, Take Your Content Marketing from Blah to Brilliant. I think we could just talk about that the whole time, Susan, honestly. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Laura. Can't wait to have this chat.
I know. We were just chatting up a storm just before going live here too, and I feel like we always have a million things to talk about and lots
True.
of laughter. So let's talk about this. Revenue-driven marketing, podcasting, growing your revenue, growing your audience, establishing authority. I think these are things that most entrepreneurs want. But
Yeah.
then you get into these nuances, like you have to start a podcast, you have to do these things, and I've felt that way. You get kind of blocked. You're like, I don't know how to do that, and we get
Mm-hmm.
stuck. So, would love just your thoughts on, why is it such a powerful form of marketing? Just to kind of establish that first before we get into any of the nuances of the hows and that. Let's talk about why it's so powerful.
I think that, for founder-led brands and for entrepreneurs in particular, like showing up powerfully in your visibility, like being clear, like, okay, that's Laura and that is her point of view. Like that thought leadership is kind of key. Like it's key to the reason why people work with you. It's key to the reason why people remember you. And so there are many ways in which you can do that. And I feel like podcasting is the hill that I would die on, quite simply because it's like got the least amount of clutter, right? I mean, we've talked about, I think before, but I'll say it for the audiences. There's like 150,000 podcasts in total that are active on a weekly basis. And just for context, there's 500 million blog posts. Like, so the zeros are not even comparable. There's like a huge opportunity from just a business case perspective. But even beyond that, I think, there are parts of like the personal development journey that you like learn. I talk about like discipline and journalistic rigor and commitment to your audiences and that kind of thing that you learn from showing up and doing a show like this on a weekly basis. That's pretty cool. Like who doesn't want to learn those things?
Yeah. So it is such an interesting, thing to look at, that there's really only 150,000, but then was it 5 million blogs? And I'm like, here I
There's
am like spending
500 million.
five. Okay.
It's not even in the
A couple
same like,
more zeros.
yeah, it's not even in the same like space is what I
Yeah.
want people to sort of visualize, right? Like it's this tiny, tiny circle in here. And then the best part is, and I'll keep going on, like I'm like, climb on this hill, I'm not gonna come down from it, Laura. I warn you. So
Yep.
interrupt
All
me as
right.
you get there.
Okay.
I'm like, and then, you start to think about, I want to create this podcast or this video, like what you're doing here. This is like a podcast. Once you've done that, that's just the start of it, or like the tip of the iceberg. From it comes like a transcript. You can use it to develop writing. You can use it to snippet it up into smaller, like piecemeal micro video. You can use it to write like multiple social blog posts. You can use it to convert it into a course, for God's sake, after you've got like a pattern, like in 3 or 4 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So really, I think that, when you start to think about it as like operationalizing your intellectual property in one format and that you're committing to it, and then you take that and then you keep working with the same stuff, so that then comes that second piece, is like you don't have to keep doing new things, because the same thing is the gift that keeps giving, right? Like after a point, and this is something we touched on in the green room as well, like we are fortunate in many ways, you and I, that this is our medium, right? We're able to show up and have this discussion and do this regardless of whether it's easy or hard in the back end. We're able to make it look effortless because it's our medium. That may not
Mm-hmm.
be the case for everyone else, but if it is, if there's any chance at all that this is something that you can do, there's so little clutter here.
Yeah. Do you find it's easier for people if they've maybe been a guest on a podcast and kind of felt like, oh, okay, that feels like their comfort level?
Yes.
Like, what would be the, that's sort of an idea of like that first step, maybe? Like for me, this this live stream was like the easiest way for me to kind of dip my toe into the idea of podcasting. Like you said,
Yeah.
it's a video, but it was the same kind of idea, but this somehow felt easier to me. So this felt like my first foray into it. But I'd also been a guest on many podcasts. So I
Right.
also understood the structure and felt
Yes.
like I could do that. So what would your
Yeah.
tips be for getting started?
I definitely think that's a good testing space to do it. Like if you're comfortable with being able to guest on podcasts and guest on any type of shows, really, like starting to like look at shows a little bit more broadly. So that is the kind of required experience that could help you. Number two,
Mm-hmm.
I think if you've been able to be a speaker on any level, whether speaker on stage or speaker in the virtual circuits, like in many ways, that's one of the positives that came out of the pandemic is that like the opportunities for that kind of thought leadership have like exploded, right? So if you
Mm-hmm.
have been able to do that, for sure, I think that's what like thinking about in terms of how do I translate that into the podcasting medium so that I can own those messages and so that I can bring the audiences to me to deliver the framework of my intellectual property, right? So that's the second thing. So guests on people's podcasts. Number two, speaking experience. And then number three, I think, if you've done any kind of delivery of webinars, delivery of like membership course stuff. Like so often we show up and teach on the regular as part of our programming, right? As entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm.
And let's not dismiss that experience just because it's not in the public domain. So that for sure as well, I think counts towards like, would I make a good podcast host? Would this be a medium? Yes, if you're comfortable in those discussions, those coaching moments, then that's definitely a sign of a podcast host in the works.
Yeah. So how do you what is the key to do you decide to host a podcast and you're like, it's marketing, I'm going to put myself out there. What do you see as the link between this and revenue?
So I often describe podcasting as like the Trojan horse of business discussions. And what I
Mm.
mean by that is that like if you invite someone to come have a discussion with you on your podcast, who is your ideal client profile, they will come. But the same thing if you're like, oh, I'd like to talk to you about my programming, which costs yada yada, that discussion is going to get you some like initial resistance, potentially excuses. It's potentially going to get you into some ghosting, depending on what the person on the other end is like expecting from it.
Yeah.
Like straight up being pitched by something is a little bit like, I think we're done with that. Like we don't do that. We do it from a place of relationship. We do it from a place of knowing, what the other person's needs and wants and hopes and dreams, that kind of stuff. And so I think the podcast platform is literally that. It's like that perpetual discovery that you get to have. And this doesn't mean that like if someone comes on your podcast, you're going to go like hit on them and be like, hey, you've been a guest, now come buy all of my services. That is exactly the opposite of what you should be doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Instead, what it is I think you're gaining these insights about the way that your ideal client profile thinks. And then you're showing them a piece of your own brain and they're going to take that away with them and then be like, hey, I was on that show with Laura, and then I'll tell someone about it. You know how it goes. It's like, it's that ripple sort of slowly building thing. And for some people, that's not what you want to hear because you're hoping there's like a silver bullet. There isn't. There's just some ways that are more natural to you and some ways that aren't. And I believe that this in the current environment, like post-pandemic, like mid-recession, like all these apocalyptic words that we say, you know, in that kind
Yep.
of in that kind of time, you really have to start thinking about how can I show up and like tell people a little bit about who I am, what my purpose is here, and how I plan to make money, because there's no shame in that, right? Like that's what we're all here to do. And so that's why I think that sort of overall like time, space, and opportunity thing, I suppose, is why I keep on and on about this.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. So how do I think a lot of people are like, I don't have time for this. I don't have a, like what's the, how do you find, with all the things you could do, right? And I talk to my clients about this all the time. And there's such a link between the work that I do and what you do, because you need to have clarity around your brand in
Yes,
order to build a podcast that is meaningful and will stand
that's right.
out, right? So we've helped a lot of clients develop like podcast names and the cover, like all the artwork. So that's
Correct.
easy, right? It removes that barrier. They're like, I just have to invite the guests and create the, do the interviews, but because
Right.
everything else is done. So I love that, there is so much synergy between what we do. And I think
Yes.
a lot of people are like, okay, well, I could do this live stream, or I could create reels, or I could go on TikTok, or I could do blogging, or I could do blah, 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 right? The list goes
Right.
on and on. What would you say to people who are like struggling with that bandwidth or that question around prioritization? And I love this
Yeah.
comment, this quote, somebody's quoting you, Trojan horse of business. There you go. I don't know who you are. If you want to say hello,
we,
it
we
just
can't
says
even
LinkedIn
see the
user.
name here, but that's
I
awesome.
know.
Like that you noticed it. It really is like a Trojan
Yeah.
horse situation. And I like these little visuals. And then as in podcasting, you'll see that. And that's why what you described there, Laura, with the synergies, there's so much of that like visuals that you need. Sometimes you can say a lot less words by just coming up with the right visual for the thing, right? So
Exactly.
yeah, that's cool. Make yourself known, commenter.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so back to my question, what would you say between sort of the bandwidth and the priority, and how
Yes.
do they figure out if this is the right thing for them, or
Tool for it.
why
Yeah.
would you say, why is that a hill? I know that's the hill you're going to die on. So like, say
So one
more.
thing I'd say is, like I have a sassy, what my daughter calls the sassy answer for you on if people say it's a bandwidth issue, I often say it's not. Bandwidth is not a time problem, it's a prioritization problem, right? So you do have to take it up like 10,000, 20,000, whatever feet to be like, what is the thing we're trying to do? Number one, for all marketers, who are you talking to and what is that problem that you're trying to solve? And then when you get more granular on what is your specific infrastructure of content marketing, is it podcasting? Is it blogging? Is it video? There's like a few formats, right? And these have evolved over the years. And like I said, in addition to the fact that there's less clutter here, one of the things that podcasting does is it systematizes. So like if I had to talk through like the steps from taking something like this, which is a discussion, and converting it into a podcast, it's like you've got this, you download the video, take out the audio, you have to put it on a hosting platform, like how you have like the Blue Notes and the GoDaddies for websites. You also have
Yeah.
things like Libsyn and Captivate for podcasts, right? So it has
Mm-hmm.
to live somewhere the same way that your podcast lives. Your website lives somewhere. And then you're going to need, because the internet will always recognize words more than it will recognize other things. Like it searches it and it indexes using words. So you
Right.
need a bit of description in some ways. You need a name that's powerful. You need like 100 or 150 word description, which is called show notes in the podcasting
Mm-hmm.
world, right? And so those are sort of like the steps that are involved in actualizing this. But once you get this system in place and you find the right level of how to get it operationalized, whether that's internally, whether you get support, this thing runs itself. And I like to call it a flywheel for that reason. In the beginning, it takes a while. Like let's say the first 6 months of podcasting, you'll feel like you're doing a lot of work. You'll feel like you're constantly interviewing people. You'll feel behind. You'll be like, oh my God, I have to review another piece of content. Like, how is this going to work? Like, but once that gets to a place where you've put it all down, you've put standard operating procedures around it, and you'll do this regardless of who you are. Because if that sounds forbidding to someone who's just listening, you'll end up doing it because there's just something about it. Like I say, I've avoided calls from my mom because I was busy with something, but I will not ditch a podcast interview. Like that's how seriously, and that's why I say journalistic like rigor. Like you come to the table
Mm-hmm.
being like, this is my job to report in whatever way in this area that I've chosen, and this is my platform, and it has integrity and it has value. And it's also like my partner in the business, Will Lamont, who he was my co-host for like a really long time, and now we're doing this solo thing. He would say, if we look back over our body of work now, we're like, there's a podcast for that. Like pretty much anything that we can have in terms of a discovery conversation with the client, or like some idea that we're coming up to pitch someone, we have a podcast for that. Like literally it'd be like, oh, in 138 we talked to Laura about that, so let's pull that one out. So that's
Right.
the kind of thing that I think you end up building for yourself with a podcast. And then once again, like, do you have bandwidth for it? Depends on, is something else doing that for you? If it is, then you probably don't have the bandwidth for it. But if nothing else is doing that for you, like if you don't have either like a solid newsletter property, or a regular webinar like series that is performing top notch, or a video, like a live video or something, you're going to need something. Because otherwise
Yeah.
you're just showing up and creating from scratch each time, and that takes a whole lot of bandwidth, and that's not going to get your business very far if the founder is just like spending all the time trying to figure out what to talk about next, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So repurposing, that's a big key. I think we should talk about that because um, I think that is so essential to this whole
It is.
platform of podcasting is you do this one interview and then you have the opportunity to repurpose it in so many different ways.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And then starting to think about it as you are not the audience for these repurposes, because often the resistance that people feel is like, oh, hasn't everyone heard this before? Am I repeating myself? Like, will Google ding me for repeating the same thing over and over again? And the answer to all of those questions is like, no, it's not. You must do it. Like, of course, if you're reproducing an exact solid wall of text in multiple places, you need to cross reference. But barring that, repetition is really what, if you look at some like again, going back to the world of journalism, if you look at media trainers to some of the biggest speakers and politicians in the world, they teach them how to go back to the same 2 or 3 key messages, right? Like the more you sort of repeat that, and the more, like, no matter what question you ask me, my answer is the same 3 points. Like that's what you need to get to. And that's what, like, if you go and do like a strategic exercise on the marketing or communications front, that's kind of what you come away with, like some sort of messaging and overarching theming. But then how are you going to deliver that? Like where are you going to go say this? Like podcasting, I would say, is a great way to do it. And let me also bring in, I think, another perspective. It's a
Yeah.
neurodiversity angle for me for podcasting as well, because for the first 100 episodes or so, we didn't even do a video format. We just showed up on a platform, and we did video for energy, but we wouldn't do anything with the video, and like we didn't plan to, and we still haven't, because some of them, we like, our hair is up in knots and you're like literally sitting in your backyard on the floor or whatever, right? So um that really attracted me to the thing. It's like I used to find it really exhausting to have these long like eye contact situations with like multiple people, even if it was virtual. I am a little bit of an introvert. Not that you would think that from my podcasting and TikToking, but that's just the way we like overcompensate. When I show up, I constantly
Right.
show up, and then I'm just like, don't talk to me anyone for like 2.5 hours, right? So so I think that the neurodiversity angle definitely was a part of why I was drawn to it. So for those out there who are like, oh my god, being on video is terrifying, like, this is, again, maybe look a little more closely at this, because there's power to the audio.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think, different people learn differently too. So, I'm not as big an audio person. Like I'll find myself listening to something, I'll be doing something, and then I'm like, do do do, my brain has like
Your brain
wandered.
floats away, yeah.
Yeah, but my husband loves it.
Yeah,
Like he listens to audiobooks, he listens to podcasts, he'll go for a run and he'll come back and he'll like share all of this with me. So he's like, I want it in my ears. I want it to go with me, and it can't
right,
if it's a video. I
right.
mean, it can, but
It can, but
you're
yeah,
not going to be watching it while you're running, right? So it's
yeah,
also by creating a podcast versus this, like a live stream, it creates a platform for people to take you with them wherever
yes,
they're going. And so that
It's
makes it
true.
easier for them to consume the content potentially.
Right. And sometimes people say, isn't that the same thing? And I myself think these things out because it's like you can only really understand the worries when you do some of the, oh, but this, but that. And one of the things is like, could you not do the same with any video? Like, could you not go and put this thing that you have on pause and come like and like deliver the same experience? And the answer is not exactly the same, and I'll tell you why. Because there are some things that they take into account in the user experience. Like if we came back and tried to watch a LinkedIn live later, it's not going to remember where you left off. It's not going to pick it up at the
Mm,
speed that you were watching it. It's not going to understand that you like watching this particular kind of thing and then suggest to you other material that you could watch from similar like creators. So those kind of things as well are that is not why you might want to go into podcasting. It doesn't hurt. Like, and those of us who are regular audio listeners, like your husband, like we appreciate these things, and we only see see that we have it when you're in a platform that you don't have it, and then you're like, oh,
yeah.
you mean I can't pause and come back to this? Like, that's annoying. Let me go back to my podcast world.
It is funny how you get like, these things you're like, how has this not been created this way?
Yeah.
My one son, slight sidebar, but still related in a way. He likes to listen to an audiobook and then read the book at the same time.
Cool.
And so because we're living abroad, he's getting books from the Toronto Library through the app on the phone. He's like, I can't listen to an audiobook and read the book at the same time. He's like, somebody needs to
Oh
create a
wow, really?
platform for me to be able to read and listen at the same time. And I was like, that sounds like an app that needs to be
It
created.
really
So it's
does.
interesting as a learning mechanism to be able to read and listen at the same time. Or, you have hearing impaired people and then they need to see you so they can, or they need to see the captioning. And so there's so many different things to consider.
Yeah, there really is. That whole accessibility discussion, it's it's just not even begun. We haven't even begun to scratch the surface. Like there's so much there. Like at least we've got to a place now in 2023 where all of the main platforms now have captioning included. So all you have to
Yep.
do as the consumer of the content is to turn on the captions, and so you're set. If not, before that, every time you made a video, you had to like burn these closed captions on, and they took time. And if you had like an accent which isn't like the typical North American accent, your words would get distorted. So there's a lot to think about there. And as small businesses, when you start to process all of these things, it's not surprising that you're like, oh my god, I'm just give up, right? And
Yeah,
so
then the barriers start to
like
build.
exactly. And which is why you need to pick, like going back to that question about like, so how do you decide if this is for you? You've got to pick one engine, whatever
Okay.
that engine might be, right? Like, so going back to marketing basics or content marketing basics, like once you've decided who your audience is, you then want to decide what you're solving for them, like what's the problem that you're solving. And then once you've done that, you're like, how best do my people like to hear from me? Like that's a question for your people right there, right? And like
Mm.
if we had like several folks along the way say to us that like we're funny and we show up in meetings and make these like quasi inappropriate jokes that get remembered, and this is why my book is called Unboring. And so there's like a vibe around the whole thing, right? And
Yeah.
so like for us, having a podcast that took like a slightly tongue-in-cheek look at sort of marketing and said what keeps you up at night, and it's called the 4 a.m. report, that turned out to be like our path. And while a lot of other people were calling themselves like, the B2B marketing and sales podcast, which is excellent for findability, but if you go and look for that right now, you'll find 7 of them. Because I was trying to find someone told me they were like a co-host on a podcast like that, and I was genuinely trying to find the dude. And it's hard because there's seven of these B2B whatevers, because that's the path you chose. And so all around me, when
Mm.
people are rebranding their podcast, and you'll identify with this, like changing the names and like sort of losing the thread a little bit, that's when you go back to like, okay, we picked podcasting because the medium worked. I have background in radio, neurodiversity needs were met, And that systematization is by far the easiest that I could find, right? Even though we were doing videos, it's like, why wouldn't you take the audio out of the video? It just seemed like a no-brainer. And then when
Yeah.
you take that and you talk about how little clutter there is, and it's like, pfft, like, why isn't everyone doing this? Like, even if they don't want to.
You have a fan, so I think this is Anna Jose, who's
Oh,
loves your
nice. I
energy.
love it.
So thank you for listening. And if you have questions for Susan, please do pop into the chat. We're going to wrap
Absolutely.
up here shortly. But so, okay, I love all of this, and it's really getting me thinking about. Obviously, we were chatting before we went live that I'm considering moving this into a
Yeah.
podcast. So,
You heard it
it's
here,
really,
folks.
we heard
This
it
is the
here.
pre-announcement. Hold her
Okay,
to
but
it.
first, like legitimately though, my husband and I are creating a podcast, the two of us, super fun bantery about our decision and move abroad to Sicily, which we're now 8 months into that adventure. But really, it started last January when we kind of made that decision. So we've mapped out that. So that's
Awesome.
gonna be my
Can't wait.
first foray into it, and it should be fun because I think there'll be a lot of laughs
That's
in
awesome. I
those.
can't wait to hear.
Yeah,
It's awesome.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then, we'll see from a business perspective, but I think it is important to look at because we are so torn. I'm like, you want to be on social media. I'm working on my blog, but now that you say like 500 million blogs, like, whew, that is,
It's
that's
hard.
intense. 500 million. So what would your thoughts be around somebody who's been blogging and going, okay, well, I could actually look at all of the content I've created on my blog and turn that into a podcast?
You really could so easily like do one from the other. It's not to say that you want to ditch the blogging. Just starting from scratch in the written medium is quite labor intensive. And this from a writer of 20 something years. Like I said, the internet always recognizes words and that's how it indexes. So you're never going to stop needing a blog. That said, when you have a podcast or an interview of any type, you're not starting with a blank page, even for the writing, right? Like you're starting with a transcript. And however long the conversation might be or roundabout the conversation might be, even if it's a Joe Rogan podcast with 3 hours, you still have a better start to multiple pieces of content than zero. Like you're still starting with something other than a blank page. And I think for a lot of us, that in itself is power.
Yeah. And I like centering it around one thing, right? Like, you talked about with yours that it's the 4 a.m. report and what keeps people up at night. It's coming up with something dynamic, but ultimately, I say this to my clients all the time, you want to have that one key message and
Yes.
everything you talk about, right, leads back to that. So if
Yes.
you know that that's the key, it's like that makes it so much easier to create content because you're like, well, now I just need to talk about this from all of these different angles.
Yeah.
So it's, I've talked about ghosting, how that impacts your brand. I've talked about, so many people pleasing, how that impacts your brand, right? But these aren't your typical kind of, branding mistakes or things that you would hear, but it's like looking at these other aspects that
Mm-hmm.
impact your brand. So it's going beyond, but if you're clear on that key message and how you want to be known, that helps you differentiate yourself no matter what you're doing, whether it's a website or a podcast.
I agree. And then it gets easier and easier and easier. And this is what I mean by that flywheel thing, where it's like, it's really hard to move this at first. And then after some time, you find yourself sort of looking around you being like, is that it? Like, am I done with all of the marketing work that I have to do? Because it does actually get simpler when you do it in this format. And if nothing else, I think it's worth thinking about from a technology perspective. Like things have come really far. Like what was only available to the select few and sort of like treating things like video and audio production like it was this high hallowed thing that needed tens of thousands of dollars, that went away, right, in the pandemic. So let's take
Yeah.
another look at this version 2.0 of production, where you're able to like show up with like the stakes are not nearly as high, and if anything, like the ones where you show up which you think is probably your vulnerable like bits, like whatever it is, right? Like whether it's the way you
Yeah.
look or what you said or how you sounded, like we're all a little yucked out by ourselves. Those are the things that people will
That's what people love about us.
That's it, exactly. And that is the power. Like I remember reading about this and then applying it back to, like, when people think about audiences, the biggest thing I hear is, oh, but the audience is so small or it's micro. And I'm like, that's power. You've got to turn it around. Like to you, it seems like that's a small audience. But to those people, they have access to you at a larger level, which they might not in a different place, And so you've got to reframe the narrative, and so and give it that depth, right, as a result of it. So I feel like we've said like a lot to do with like how you do need the one platform, right? Yes, podcasting is perhaps the place where you can create that major difference, but that said, it doesn't have to be. Like, let's say you've made a really solid start on your newsletter and you find it really easy to write it, right? And then keep it at that, and then start converting those to blogs after a month, and then convert that into a podcast after 3 months. Try to see if you can make short form video, but pick an anchor. We call it an anchor. You have to have one anchor infrastructure piece. From that, other things can come.
I love that. Okay, I have one more question.
Yes.
You talked about weekly, that there's only 150,000 podcasts that show up weekly. Yeah. What is a good cadence? So somebody's like, every week I have to show up in a podcast. I know people take breaks or they do it in kind of episodes. Is there a best practice for frequency with podcasts?
Yeah. I have a framework that we'll share with you. I do believe for the first 25 episodes, it's worth doing weekly. And the reason for that is just to distinguish yourself from many folks who do 5 or 6 episodes and then they'd stop. Like, so 7 episodes is the sort of like the death number. Like the 7-year itch is the 7 episode itch of podcasting. So there are a lot of podcasts that
just
drop
get past 7. Okay.
Yeah. So given that, I'd say speed through as best as you can, as close to 25 as you possibly can on a weekly basis. And then after that, move to twice a month for the first year. And once you've got to about 50 episodes, you pick. Like, you are the master of your own destiny at that point. Monthly is probably advisable, but like if you can't sustain it, or you've created a deep enough body of work to start to be like, I want to break this off into something else, or I also want to do a live, or it gives you some room to play.
I love that. That's great guidance. So there's a question. I think it's from our same user here.
Writing?
LinkedIn user. Do you miss writing?
No, I write all the time, because regardless of whether or not I show up in this medium, I'm still like, we're preparing, like much as I host my own podcast, like coming in to a live room and talking is terrifying to me. It's like, I prepare for things, I look through material. So there is some amount of writing in that process. And then, you take materials out of the podcasting and then you write out of it. I manage all of my own social media writing. Sure, there's like help to execute some of it, but like the voice and the material has got to come from, the founder when it's the founder-led brand, right? So I don't miss writing. We also do a whole bunch of like pretty serious writing for clients on a few levels. So no, I don't miss writing, but I can promise you this, regardless of whether a person has a podcast or not, I will get them to record out anything. Like, instead of having like 100 meetings and like 50 emails, I'll be like, can we just do this real quick? I'm going to record it and then use the transcript.
Yeah. Powerful. I think we could talk all day, but our time is done. Thank you so much for being here. Always so fun. I feel like we always have such a great conversation, and I definitely, I'm going to come back to this. I definitely was, making notes of things for my upcoming podcast.
This is your sign, yeah.
Plural, yes. This is my sign. I'm saying it. There's a podcast in the future. So thank you so much, and thank you for sharing all of your amazing things. How can people connect with you? What's the best way? What's the what?
I am really active on LinkedIn. I'm also cp.digital is our website. A whole lot of free and paid resources on there. So take a look.
Amazing. Everybody follow Susan. She's a wealth of knowledge and super fun. Check out the podcast, The 4am Report. I was a guest and it was super fun. So thank you for having me on that as well and sharing your platform with me.
It's awesome. Thank you for having me here, and
amazing.
We'll talk soon.
All right. Thanks everybody for joining.